Originally, I was going to keep this list to 5 books, but ultimately couldn't make up my mind. Instead, by going through my top 10 books, I was able to come up with my favorite reads of the whole year. Though this is my first such listicle, I made a point last January of beginning a reading journal. As bookworms, there is no better way to usher in the new year than by reviewing the stories we've enjoyed over the past 12 months. For a variety of reasons, I loved the books I chose, and I'm always happy to offer my personal recommendations to those readers who'd like them. While this channel primarily focuses on fantasy, I read a variety of genres, including drama, classic literature, and Regency romance. As such, this list reflects that, and for each book, I'm going to offer a brief explanation of why I enjoyed it. Before we continue, I'm Riley and this is Otherworldly Fiction. On this channel, I rant about fantasy books, discuss characters and lore, share my bookish opinion, and offer the occasional writing advice. If any of that sounds like your cup of tea, hit the subscribe button. Posts are on Fridays. As a disclaimer, there may be spoilers for the books I discuss here. You have been warned. Reflecting on the previous year can be a great way to recommend new books to others, as well as keep track of your own reading habits. Here, then, are my top 10 books of 2022. Book number 1, A Court of Thorns and Roses. As a follower of BookTok, the ACOTAR series had been on my TBR for a while. People kept raving about the book, discussing their favorite characters or why they loved the series. The synopsis intrigued me, especially since Cassandra Clare and Holly Black had instilled in me the Fae obsession standard to this decade, and I was eager to see how I liked Mass's writing. Also, everyone on BookTok kept venting about some guy named Tamlin, and after the 10th or so rant about him, I was dying of curiosity to find out A, who he was, and B, what the hell he did wrong. With this motivation in mind, I began A Court of Thorns and Roses, and was not disappointed. The story drew me in straight away with its high stakes. If the protagonist didn't find more food soon, her family would starve. Worse, from the opening chapter, she managed to incur the wrath of the all-powerful and supposedly vicious Fae by killing one of their own. Whisked away by the infamous Tamlin, she wasn't sure she would ever see her family again. After such a powerful opening, I appreciated other aspects of the book. First, I liked that there was downtime between the action. Feyre was able to explore her new home, talk to the other characters, and eventually get to know both Tamlin and Lucien. Although I knew Tamlin was supposed to screw up later, I didn't mind the initial romance. I enjoyed that the characters were allowed to talk to each other. Though there was danger, they built a gradual rapport, revealing more of themselves, their feelings, and their troubles. Although it wasn't great that Tamlin kidnapped his love interest, learning more about his backstory at least made his motivations understandable. Secondly, there was the book's climax, which was tense the entire way through, especially when Mass threw in the as-yet unknown element of Rysand. The various trials Feyre had to face, especially given the horrid conditions she had to survive in between them, made for some rapid page-turning, and the ending was equally jolting. Finally, I liked that Feyre herself wasn't a squeaky clean character. I wouldn't say she's an anti-hero in the sense Selena is, but she came close. The book opens with her essentially murdering a Fae out of a mixture of spite and a need to survive. And it isn't until later she's able to appreciate the gravity of what she's done. What's more, the need to save the Fae as a whole forces her to kill again in order to fulfill the bargain she's made. A choice which, while done for the welfare of the whole, leaves Feyre even more traumatized. Afterwards, I read the next 3 books in the series and was not disappointed. Though all were 5-star reads from me, I exclude them from this list simply because A, I wanted to give other books room, and B, I loved them for the same reasons as the first, making further explanation redundant. The series as a whole had strong world building, fleshed-out characters, and plot twists which kept me burning through the books. Though Mass's books are long, I read this series in just over a week because I couldn't put them down. Number 2. Throne of Glass. Having enjoyed the ACOTAR series and Mass's writing in general, I was curious about her other big series, Throne of Glass. Not everyone who likes ACOTAR enjoys Throne of Glass and vice versa, but I'm happy to report that for me, Throne of Glass, along with its prequel and sequels, were 5-star reads for me. Selena, or Aelin, was one of my favorite protagonists. I'm a sucker for anti-heroes, especially if they have a prickly manner and a penchant for sarcasm, and Aelin fits that bill. Moreover, I loved how, as the series progressed, even the hero of the story managed to remain mysterious, revealing pieces of herself to the readers. The story had much of what I loved in ACOTAR. Downtime where the characters could spend time getting to know each other, life or death stakes, protagonist trauma, love-to-hate monarchs, steamy romance, and even cases where the first romance or 2 didn't work out, something I found added a level of realism to both series. All in all, I loved Throne of Glass, and it's a series I'd happily read again someday. If you were an ACOTAR reader who enjoys reading about evil kings, sadistic fae women, underdogs turned royalty, or sizzling romance, Throne of Glass and its sequels include all of these same elements. Plus, there are even hints that the 2 worlds exist alongside each other. Book number 3, The Ichabog. I was impressed by Rowling's latest children's book, not only because it's her first fantasy story since Harry Potter, but because it's just a great story. I went into the book expecting a well-written fantasy adventure, and it is that, but as with Harry Potter, or even some books by Roald Dahl, the book can be surprisingly dark, and I appreciated that. This is only my opinion, but I think kids should be exposed to darker elements in their stories. As someone who grew up on Harry Potter and The Hunger Games, I was never traumatized by what I read. In fact, kid me was of the mind that the more gruesome the better. I bring up The Hunger Games here because the Ichabog's world does come to resemble Panem more than Hogwarts, especially when you take the graveyard full of children into account. Yes, you heard that right. The book mentions a wretched orphanage, where the conditions and lack of access to proper food are so great that children die on a regular basis. The story can be quite dark, but there's plenty of whimsy in it too, which helps to contrast with the grimmer portions. And the characters themselves are as well rendered as any of the heroes or villains you might encounter in the Harry Potter books. Some of the characters are even what you might call morally gray, with the king being someone who hurts people through his ignorance, but later repents. A strong story always benefits from multi-dimensional characters. Always. Okay, moving on. As for the reveals of the monster itself, the titular Ichabog, these are also well done, as the reader is continually kept guessing about its existence. The whole is it or isn't it real debate is as convoluted as the is Snape bad or is he good question. And as with Snape, the reveals, contradicting each other as they do, never get old. Book number 4, Out of the Silent Planet. Many love the Chronicles of Narnia, and with Netflix's latest acquisition to the rights, Narnia, along with its author, is again a topic of discussion. However, even the most die-hard fans might be unaware that C.S. Lewis, the creator of Narnia, penned yet another series. a science fiction series which explores other planets, aliens, and corrupt government organizations. Lewis's space trilogy is interesting because, science-focused as it is, it retains much of the Christian themes Lewis was preoccupied with. Only, instead of exploring Christian allegories through pagan symbols like Greek gods or centaurs, he explores those same themes through the lens of science. In this series, he acknowledges the existence of science, but, as with many science fiction authors, comes to caution against its misuses. I enjoyed all 3 books, but out of The Silent Planet, the first in the series, is easily my favorite. Of the 3, it is the most traditional story, focusing more on exploration and action. Moreover, of the 3, the first book also has the most intriguing world building. The protagonist, Dr. Ransom, a man with an academic background, has to reconsider everything he thinks he knows when he is brought to the planet of Malacandra, an alien world rife with strange foliage and not 1 but 3 intelligent alien civilizations. The book discusses how Earth's only having 1 intelligent species is unusual, and ultimately detrimental because, without having equals, humans have become arrogant, developing a superiority complex over others. As for the alien species themselves, each group has their own customs, lifestyles, and culture. For this reason alone, I love the book, because seeing how these disparate groups interact with both their own kind and their contemporaries is fascinating. As he does in Narnia, Lewis also has supernatural figures within his world which represent both God and his son, but it never comes across as heavy-handed. Though the second book is an allegory for the Garden of Eden, the planets he creates, and the vivid descriptions he paints them with, are gripping, and readers who don't find Narnia too preachy shouldn't have a problem with the space trilogy. At the very least, if you're looking for a science fiction adventure with intriguing world building, solid adventure, and unique alien races, Out of the Silent Planet is a worthwhile read. If you love commentary on humanity itself, and a discussion of our flaws, the trilogy as a whole is worth reading. By the way, the third book has an adorable bear in it who loves to chill with the heroes, so that's something to consider. As an aside, if you've enjoyed this video so far, remember to hit the like button so more can enjoy it. Book number 5, Room. This is one of the few books on my list which isn't a fantasy. But as someone who wants to write complex characters and explore their psychology, I try to make a point of reading dramas or thriller dramas, and this is one book I had to read after enjoying the movie. Not everyone will find a child's voice easy to follow, but I personally enjoy reading the story from Jack's perspective. His voice and the way he thinks, as well as those things he values, are in keeping with his age. Overall, his voice is believable. Plus, it softens the more horrific elements of the story. Jack, only 5 years old, views a gruesome situation through the lens of innocence. As adult readers, we can read between the lines. The reality of Jack's situation is disturbing, yet Jack's youth protects him to a degree. It never occurs to Jack that he is the product of the abuse his mother has faced at the hands of her captor, or that there's a whole world, with school and friends, that he's being deprived of. Instead, even as the character observes his mother's behavior, enabling the reader to understand the true situation, Jack remains more concerned with getting his mom to play with him, having time to watch television, and being allowed to read the same book for the 100th time. The way in which the story is told is cleverly done, offering a convincing glimpse into a child's mind, and how their innocence ultimately protects them from the harsh realities adults are all too aware of. It's not the most cheerful story, and Jack's mother continues to suffer even after managing to escape. But the story ends on a hopeful note, and it was one of those books I read in one sitting, only closing it at 4 in the morning. Book number 6, Pride and Prejudice. This one was technically a reread, but one which was worthwhile. When I first read Pride and Prejudice, I loved it. However, there were elements of the story which went over my head, simply because I lacked an understanding of the time it took place in. Since my first read, though, I'd not only watched dozens of Austen films, but I'd been given a more thorough education on Regency times by Ellie Dashwood's YouTube channel. As an aside, Ellie's catalog of videos is perfect for those looking for a Regency Times 101. Now knowledgeable when it came to naming customs, titles, and how entails functioned, I was better able to appreciate Austen's works. Moreover, being older, I was much more aware of both the characters' nuances and Austen's tongue-in-cheek humor. Austen's prose, at least in my opinion, is brilliant. Her dry humor kept me laughing, with such characters as Mr. Collins making me grin. And the actual dialogue between Lizzie and Darcy was well done too. Without any spice or kissing, Austen created a gripping romance through the strength of her characters alone. Elizabeth herself is a protagonist readers can still relate to, being spirited, clever, and ahead of her time. And her willingness to challenge Darcy and argue with him makes their relationship one I love to follow. I love all of Jane Austen's books and would happily reread any of them. But Pride and Prejudice remains not only my favorite Austen book, but one of my top 10 books of all time. Book number 7, The Cruel Prince. Returning to the fantasy genre, The Cruel Prince was another book I burned through. As with ACOTAR, it was constantly hyped on BookTok. As such, I had to read it for myself to see what all the noise was about, and I wasn't disappointed. Jude won't be every reader's cup of tea, but her fight to survive, even if it means she has to kill, is as high stakes as it gets. A human raised among the cunning Fae, Jude has to learn to be as ruthless as they are if she hopes to survive. She can come across as cold and calculating, but, as I've mentioned earlier in this video, I enjoy a protagonist who's less black and white. What's more, all of the characters are well developed, and, like Jude, all are what you'd call morally gray. Though their hearts might be in the right place, all can be cruel, vicious, or cunning, and that includes not only Cardan, the titular cruel prince, but those Jude considers family. Taryn, Jude's sister, initially comes across as the innocent one, but readers eventually learn she can be as ruthless as her sister, albeit in a different way. Then there's the matter of Jude's adoptive father, a redcap who literally murdered her real parents. Their relationship dynamic is fascinating because, even with the past they share, there's a genuine affection on both sides. Whatever choices they make, neither seems capable of actually hating the other. Murderer and traitor that he is, Maddox cares about his human daughters, and the relationship dynamic he shares with Jude was fascinating for me. Then, of course, there's Cardan, the cruel prince Jude will ultimately fall in love with. My only gripe about the series was that I wanted to see more of the two together. Jude doesn't put up with any crap, and their relationship impacted and was affected by the tight plot, making it feel more integral. I wanted to see a couple more kisses, a little more yearning, and a few more shared conversations between the pair. But I can appreciate that the story wasn't necessarily written as a romance first. Where it shines is in its exploration of the characters themselves, the tight twists, the family dynamics explored, and the stakes the characters must face. What we do get from the romance is well done, complementing, as I've said, the plot itself. And the fact that I wanted more was a good complaint to have. Despite the fact I could have used a little more time between Cardan and Jude, the book and its two sequels was a 5-star read for me, and Jude was one of my favorite protagonists. Book number 8, Carmilla. As someone who loved Dracula when I read it, and is obsessed with vampires, Carmilla was a book which was long on my TBR list, actually predating Dracula and even serving as inspiration to Bram Stoker. Carmilla was one story I had to read. It was a book I expected to enjoy, and thankfully I did. First, it's simply well written. Sheridan Le Fanu does a good job of setting scenes and describing them. It's easy to picture the chilly castle corridors and mist-shrouded forests he brings us to, and his descriptions of Carmilla herself, while supernatural, feel grounded in reality. Carmilla doesn't go around reeking of blood or flashing her fangs. Instead, the hints of her curse are more subtle. The author makes a point of describing her odd moods and the strange way she moves. People can find her unnerving when they meet her, without being able to explain why. At the same time, she can be charismatic. As others have said, there are also gay undertones. While you could never describe the relationship between Laura and Carmilla as a healthy one, the fact that there was a semblance of a relationship at all in a book written in the 1800s is notable. Laura isn't exactly in love with Carmilla, but she's drawn to the vampire despite herself. The book explores our hidden desires, and what happens, for good or ill, when we give in to them. As for Carmilla, she has no shame. Yes, she's a vampire who will eventually kill you, but it's hard to hate her because, beneath her need to feed, there's a wistfulness. Carmilla does seem to be genuinely attached to Laura, and at one point she shocks Laura by more or less telling her she loves her. Carmilla's statement isn't overly romantic, but it also doesn't feel platonic. Carmilla is trying to tell Laura how she feels, and modern readers might interpret Carmilla's being a vampire as a metaphor for her being gay. It's worth noting that her victims tend to be female, and Carmilla enjoys developing a relationship with them before the need to feed takes over. As a reader, I felt for her, because, as with many other vampire characters, there's a tragedy to Carmilla. She represents the other, the person who wants to fit in and love someone, but can't because of differences beyond her control. As for Laura, she's the kind of person who's fascinated with the unknown, but who's being conditioned by her society to fear it. All in all, I loved the book for its exploration of Laura and Carmilla as characters, as well as for the gothic ambience. And it's a good book to read before Halloween if you're looking for a classic vampire story. Given the plethora of Dracula retellings, it's only a shame Carmilla hasn't been explored further by filmmakers or authors, because she's as mysterious and sympathetic as the Count she'd go on to inspire. Book number 9, A Monster Calls. This is one of my more recent reads, and as with Room, I was inspired to read it after first enjoying the movie. A children's fantasy story which takes place within our world, this book deals with heavy issues, exploring the effects of grief and the guilt we carry when forced to face loss, as well as the difficulties of growing up through tragedy. The book is beautifully written. The main character goes through the typical stages of grief, giving into anger, denial, and ultimately acceptance. A part of him even wants that which he is dreading to happen, if only so he doesn't have to deal with it anymore. And it is this, Connor's guilt, which the monster forces him to acknowledge. It isn't only his loss, but his feelings around the loss, which are important. The book, with its monster and the stories the monster tells, reveals to children and adult readers alike that nothing is black and white. We can all be cruel. There aren't always obvious good guys or bad guys, and the world can be harsh, even unjust. Not every story is going to have a happy ending, but the protagonist learns how he can cope, how even when things are bad, he can learn to accept them without blaming himself for feelings which are perfectly natural. If you're looking for something cheerful, this story isn't it. However, if you have a box of tissues handy, this award-winning book, which includes incredible illustrations, is worth an afternoon read. It isn't a long book, but in its short time, it manages to explore grief itself and the challenges of growing up through it. Book number 10, Bridgerton, An Offer from a Gentleman. At the end of my list, I have to include the third Bridgerton book. An Offer from a Gentleman follows the story of Sophie and Benedict, and is, functionally, a Cinderella retelling. I have mixed feelings about retellings. Some feel redundant, especially when it comes to the Cinderella template, while others feel fresh, but thankfully, An Offer from a Gentleman proves to be the latter. With no magic or fantasy of any kind, this retelling fits the story within the confines of the real world, and that of the Regency times. Sophie is a bastard in a time when only those children born within wedlock were considered legitimate, a position which forces her to live in the margins of society. Educated more than a middle-class girl would be, but treated as less than nobility, she is treated as little more than a ward by her own father. In fact, she isn't even allowed to think of him as such. In time, Sophie's father, who pretends he isn't her father, remarries, elevating his adopted daughters and their mother over his own flesh and blood. This is where the Cinderella element comes in, as, with her father removed, Sophie has no rights when compared with her stepfamily. Eventually, her treatment compels Sophie to run away, only to meet Benedict, who's easily my favorite of the Bridgerton brothers. While I have a certain fondness for Cinderella stories, this wasn't the only reason Book 3 was my favorite Bridgerton book. Compared to other books in the series, An Offer from a Gentleman has higher stakes. While characters like Alois might face some embarrassment if they don't marry, Sophie faces very real threats: hunger, poverty, shame, and potential imprisonment among them. With much more to lose, Sophie's character grabbed me more than the others. Even Benedict, likable as he is, had his flaws, because his urging for Sophie to become no more than his mistress because of her birth was so hurtful to her. Moreover, if she'd chosen such a life, she'd have been dooming her own children to her fate. Such a societal obstacle made the romance stick out to me when compared with the other books, because Sophie and Benedict had more obstacles than their own misgivings to overcome in order to be together. To actually marry, they had to challenge society itself, which meant that, while accepted by their family, they'd likely be ostracized by others. Plus, I liked other characters in the story too, such as Posy. One of Sophie's stepsisters, Posy actually feels for Sophie, and while An Offer from a Gentleman isn't the first Cinderella retelling to show one of the stepsisters being kind, it's a twist I always appreciate. Posy can be bullied in her own way, and I was happy to see Sophie get one decent sister. In conclusion, whether for their strong characters, their tight plot twists, their world building, or their exploration of themes, these have been my top 10 books of the year, and all are books I'd happily read again. Each had characters I loved, and tough situations those characters had to face, and all were 5-star reads. My only complaint is that so many of these stories don't yet have television or film adaptations. While I read a couple after falling in love with their movie counterparts first, stories like Out of a Silent Planet, and even the famed Carmilla, are largely overlooked. I can only hope that these stories gain attention from readers, not only through adaptation, but by being read for their own merits. As we head into the new year, it's my wish that more readers will add these books to their 2023 TBRs and love them as much as I did. What were your top 10 books of the year? Would you like to read any of the books on this list? Have you already read some of them? Sound off in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and happy reading!